Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant. Let's get into it. So in today's episode, I want to speak about something that has been going on for years, or rather the impact of it has been dragging on for years. And I want to speak about this particular thing because we've recently had a report come out, which was so damning. And I really didn't think that the report got the attention that it deserved, considering the contents, considering the details, considering the impact this has on us as a society, and also considering the impact that it has had on the way that we see ourselves as a society, specifically in the UK, the way that we like to present ourselves. This report is so damning. So if you haven't guessed it by now, obviously I'm talking about the Grenfell report. And I've been thinking about, since the report came out and I read it, I was thinking about how to do something about this to, I wouldn't say moralize because that sounds ridiculous, but almost to get it out to people and have them engage with it, have them understand some of the complexities. Some of it isn't complex, some of it's very simple and straightforward, but highlight things in the report that are sometimes missed when we just always read the headlines, right? So when these things come out, we know about the Grenfell report, but how many people took time to read it? And that isn't necessarily an indictment on anyone in particular, because I understand that people are busy, and we have other things going on in our lives. But I think this is so fundamental in so many ways to the way society has failed. The social contract that we have has failed, how we're failing the most vulnerable people in our society, and how even when that is exposed, even when it's laid out in very clear terms, there is almost this need to just jump on something else in the news cycle and push agendas. And I made an episode about the housing situation, the lack of housing in the UK, and the state that we're in, the condition where we don't have enough people in homes in this country. We don't have enough homes. They haven't built enough for decades. And Grenfell is just one part of that exploded. And the way that I'm going to treat this episode, or what I've decided, is that I don't want to rush through things. I don't want to rush through everything. I want to try and treat this episode and this subject matter with the respect that I think it deserves, and sometimes the respect that it's lacking when it's dealt with in other corners, namely when the report was read out in Parliament, how a number of MPs decided that was their time to leave the chambers, which I just think is so disgraceful and is just a damning indictment of our political system and how they see certain factions of society. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this over 2 episodes just because I don't want to rush anything. And I want to take you through it again. So this may be, again, triggering from some people. If that is the case, just skip through it. You can go to the second episode where I'll talk more about the individuals within the report and what is called out, to show how nefarious and how egregious some of the practices that were going on and are still going on, by the way, are in this industry. But I want to start with the story of Grenfell, because it's one that if you live in the UK, and particularly if you live in London, it touched so many people. And so I can only kind of speak, I guess, from my perspective and how I found out about Grenfell at the time. And I think when we look at technology today, we take it for granted. Even some of us that grew up without technology, we take for granted sometimes. And the first thought that comes to our head was, what about this? What about that? And we don't realize how quickly we are advancing in technology. And I say that because I remember, so if I go back to 2016, actually, rather than 2017, in 2016, I went to Jamaica. And when I was in Jamaica, I met some American girls. I'm just going to call them American girls. And one of them in particular I stayed in touch with, and we were cool. We would chat every so often. So fast forward now to 2017. And in June 2017, she starts calling my phone at a ridiculous hour. And those days I didn't really understand about Do Not Disturb. And so I was like, why is she calling my phone? And she's like, hey friend, I'm watching the news and I can see that there are buildings on fire in London. And I said, what are you talking about? So this is the middle of the night, obviously, because the fire started at 1 o'clock in the morning on June the 14th in 2017. And the news had already spread around the world. And she had seen it. I think at the time she was still living in Texas. And she'd seen it and she'd called me and she was like, are you okay? And obviously it's one of those things where you don't really have an idea. Well, why would she know where exactly I would be in relation to this fire? So at that time, I then tried to look through the snippets you can on social media. So I was looking through, like, I think Snapchat, loads of videos were coming out from there. And it was just horrific. It was just horrific to see this huge tower block ablaze, for want of it. It was just an inferno. And so for people that don't know the story, perhaps you don't live in the UK or you've never heard of Grenfell. So Grenfell is a tower block, what we call, in the UK, we call these council estates. And council estate refers to social housing that is provided by the government, the state, not all the time. Sometimes it goes through, housing associations and such, but generally it's called social housing. And the interesting thing about London, which people think is a good thing and sometimes a bad thing, is that you can have extreme wealth right next to quite abject poverty in Western terms. And I say that because this tower was situated in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And I'll come back to that. But there's a reason it's called the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And so I'll get back to that. I'll get back to where the situation. So what happened? Grenfell Tower was a 24-story tower, 24 stories. And it's situated in North Kensington, as I said, in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And on the 14th of June in 2017, a fire broke out. And I believe the fire broke out on the 4th floor. A refrigerator caught alight. And what then ensued was the fire just quickly spread through the whole building. And people became trapped and they couldn't get out. And so even if you know nothing about council estates in the UK, you must know about social housing. And actually sometimes, let me preface this, I understand that in some parts of Northern Europe, for example, social housing isn't class-based, shall I say, isn't about whether you can afford to rent or not. It's just basically if you want social housing, it's available to you. In the UK, if you want social housing, it's usually not available to you. And these people are generally not considered as upwardly mobile, shall we say, as other people. Working class people, from diverse backgrounds, sometimes immigrants, but certainly ethnically diverse in this block. And what was really interesting for me, because whenever something big like this happens, and it still happens now, and it's happened since the beginning of time, there will be rumours that come out. And what was interesting to me was that the first sort of rumours that I heard were about the gentleman in whose apartment the fire started saying, oh, did you hear that when the fire started, he just left the house and walked off and didn't say anything, which was not true. But it was very interesting how quickly the narrative came to blame the individuals for this. Now, the thing about Grenfell is that tower burned for 60 hours. It burned for 60 hours and claimed 72 lives, with many others injured and hundreds, displaced from their homes. And it wasn't that it was just a tragedy. Of course, any fire is a tragedy, but this was a national scandal. And it really sparked outrage in many people. People were concerned. Some of you will or may not remember that even, Stormzy, one of his songs when he was performing, I believe, at Glastonbury, he mentioned Grenfell and says, don't think that we've forgotten about Grenfell. And so the questions were asked, how did this happen in a modern city, in modern day Britain? How was a fire able to spread so quickly and take so many lives? And what we're going to do, first off, which is where everyone started, is we're going to talk about cladding. So a few years before the Grenfell fire, the tower had undergone £10 million worth of refurbishment. That's between 2012 and 2016. So as part of this refurbishment, external cladding was installed to improve the building's aesthetic look and supposedly the installation. So as part of this, some external cladding was installed in order to improve apparently the insulation of the building, but also as an upgrade to the aesthetic appearance. And I'm doing this. But actually, do you remember when I said that Grenfell Tower was situated in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea? The wealthier residents, the people with money, felt that the building was ugly. And so rather than really trying to enhance the quality of the lives for the tenants that lived within the building, what was important was to get cladding that made it look more visually appealing to the people that had to live amongst these working class UK citizens. So this cladding is applied, and unfortunately, not only is the cladding highly flammable, but it becomes the primary reason that the fire spreads so quickly. So the cladding was made up of an aluminium composite material with a polyethylene core, which is highly combustible. So it effectively acted like a chimney, funneling the flames up the building. So in the UK, you might be thinking, well, how did this happen? Surely you should have regulation that prohibits the use of this kind of material. Oh, yeah, we do. But the cladding was signed off anyway. And by the way, reports revealed later that the more expensive cladding, which was fire resistant, would have just been an extra £5,000. So the decision to try and cut costs and make this building visually appealing for the neighbours ultimately cost lives. And people started with the cladding, but if we're honest, the cladding wasn't the only problem. There were multiple failures in fire safety at the Grenfell Tower. Because we can start with this stay put policy. And this was one of the things that when I was kind of watching it in real time via social media, that was one of the things that was confusing. Because there were a lot of people that were saying, they needed to stay put. And we were hearing this from people on the ground, people that were speaking to people within the building, people that were speaking to people within the building that are no longer with us. And imagine the horror and the confusion of being stuck in this inferno and not knowing whether you should try to get out or whether you should stay within this building that you can see is burning up around you. So if you're unfamiliar with the term stay put is a fire evacuation policy. It's a strategy designed for high-rise buildings. So effectively what they say is you stay put because the fire safety measures that are in place should contain the fire within the apartment in which it started. So in theory, the residents should have been safe in their flats because the building's fireproofing was supposed to stop the spreading of the flames. But with Grenfell, because the cladding was essentially fueling the flames, this advice turned deadly. The fire spread really rapidly on the outside of the building due to the cladding, and so people essentially became trapped in their apartments. So then there was also an issue with the fire alarm. Many residents didn't hear the fire alarm, or there was a delay in them hearing it, so they weren't able to evacuate. And then there was also a single staircase to evacuate. That was the only way that they could get down. And it's a really weird thing. You know how like when you're a kid, you have these like weird thoughts. I often remember looking at these high rises because although I grew up in a council estate, it wasn't one of these kind of 24-story blocks. And I remember looking at them as a kid and always thinking, well, if there's a fire in the middle, how do the people in top get down? How do the people on top get down? And, we were told, there will be other escape routes. They'll have something. I know, that's when I really started clocking in New York. They have these external staircases that go outside that you can use to escape a building. So I always used to think about that. But to think that these people were trapped in a 24-story building and there was a single staircase with which people on floor 24 would have been required to try to get down in order to escape is outrageous. And so in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell fire, there was a sense of shock, there was a sense of outrage. Survivors, families, and victims themselves felt that their concerns that they had been raising for years were just ignored, and this was the result. Residents of Grenfell Tower had repeatedly raised their concerns about fire safety with the management company, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, but nothing was ever done. And at the time, the government's response was also heavily criticised. Many people saw it as too slow, particularly in rehousing the survivors, some of whom, by the way, were living in temporary accommodation years later. Then there were the inquiries led by Sir Martin Moore-Bick, which were meant to investigate what happened, who was responsible, and establish how future tragedies could be prevented. So the first phase of the inquiry, which focused on what happened on the night, concluding that the cladding was the primary reason for the rapid spread of the fire. But the second phase, which investigated how the cladding got there in the first place, has exposed a much deeper and frankly quite disturbing level of neglect. Grenfell wasn't just a freak accident. I want that to be clear, and that will also be clear when we get to the second episode and we listen to some of the bits of the report. It was basically a tragedy waiting to happen in every sense of the word, and it's symbolic of wider systemic issues in the UK. We've got class inequality, housing neglect, and government oversight. As I said before, most of the residents were from low-income, ethnically diverse backgrounds. They were living in one of the wealthiest boroughs in the whole country, and yet their safety was deprioritised. And I mentioned before that RBKC, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the world. And for context, for people that don't know about the UK, this is where you will find multi-million pound houses, luxury boutiques, and some of the wealthiest individuals in the world living. Yet right in the middle of that, right in the middle of all this wealth, you had the Grenfell Tower, a building occupied by ordinary working class people. These were people living in social housing, often feeling invisible, forgotten, or outright abandoned by those in power. And that is despite living in one of the wealthiest corners of London. They were treated like second-class citizens. And I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating, because I think there's often this tendency to blame the poor for their plight, saying, well, I don't know why you're talking for them, because they're not talking for themselves. They can't stand up for themselves. Why haven't they did anything about it? And I think that when you come from a position of privilege, you don't understand how unseen and unheard it is to exist as a working class person, as a person that's a member of the lower class, trying to advocate for yourself, especially when it comes to governmental departments or local authority. Because residents had long raised concerns about the safety in Grenfell. They spoke about the lack of proper fire exits, for example, the faulty wiring, the poor maintenance. They were repeatedly ignored. Both the local council and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation treated these people like they did not matter. Cost-cutting decisions were made, poor materials were used, unsafe materials were used, and corners were cut, all in the name of saving money. I also want to mention that sometimes people think about governmental organisations, or governmental departments rather, and especially local authorities. We hear a lot about how broke they are, how broke the council is. You know, Croydon is perennially broke, Croydon Council. However, I want to point out that this same borough, this same council gave a rebate to their rich residents because they had a surplus one year. So this was not a council that was necessarily strapped for cash. They were just not making appropriate decisions for the most vulnerable in their community. What this tragedy has also demonstrated, especially in the first instance, and even before we get to this second phase of the inquiry, is that there is definitely still a huge social underclass within the UK. A group of people that are effectively abandoned by the system, even when they live just down the road from the rich and the powerful. And this is why I find it so ironic when people have these arguments about whether we should appropriately tax wealthy individuals, when they say, oh, but they'll leave the country and they make the country better. We have wealthy people here, and yet 72 people still lost their lives right down the road. Some of those wealthy people could possibly look out of their window and see the smoke rising and the flames engulfing a building. That's how close they were. So this idea, again, this fascination we have with just living next to extremely wealthy individuals because apparently that will roll down. What we're seeing is it exacerbates not only the wealth gap, but the way in which ordinary citizens in the country are treated. And it also reminds me, because when we have conversations in the UK, even when we're talking, for example, about race, a lot of people have been kind of using this kind of weird catchphrase now, where it's like, well, we don't really have a race problem, but we have a class problem. As though class problems are somehow just even better. It's fine. We don't see colour, but we do see class. So there's that. First of all, that's not even true. We have both. But the second thing is, this class problem is almost thrown around with a kind of frivolity that it's like, it's fine. We just had, people that lived like Bridgerton, or we just had aristocracy here, and that's all it is. We just had that, but it's just a legacy of something. And actually, it's something far more dangerous and insidious than that. The class divide in the UK isn't just a social issue. It's literally a matter of life and death. The people of Grenfell were failed by the government. They were failed by their council. They were failed by these companies that cut costs. They were failed by regulators. They were left to die in a building while being surrounded by the most prosperous and wealthy people in London's elite circles, elite class. If they, who shared the same streets with the wealthy people, still were abandoned in this way, what is this fascination with us just having these people living here as though that's going to somehow enhance the quality of all of our lives? It isn't. It isn't. And for me, this tragedy isn't just about the fire, but it's about what that fire symbolized. And I think when you read the report and you think of it against the backdrop of how these people were treated, I just don't understand how in today people can see things very clearly with their eyes, know what's going on, and still turn a blind eye to the huge class inequality in this country, but also the real dire implications that come from that. This idea that we're having now where people want us to cry because they may need to pay, 20% more for the VAT for their child to attend a private school, which they're not obligated to send their child to. Cry me a river. Like, do you see what is happening to people? Do you see the real world implications of this class inequality? And now we're supposed to be like, well, this is just envy politics. That's all. It's just because you can't afford it. Well, apparently you can't either. So there we are. How about that? And I just get so sick of it because there are such stark disparities, not only in the way that people are regarded, but in the way that their people are treated and the way that they interact with society and the care that is taken when their lives are in danger, when they are victims of something. And there is no, or there isn't, that's wrong of me to say there is none. There is not enough collective outrage about these things. There is not enough. Because let's face it, Grenfell wasn't a one-off disaster. It wasn't a one-off disaster. It is years of inequality and neglect and oversight or lack of oversight. It's what happens when you create a society that only looks after or cares about the opinions of one group of people. It is what happens when you push for a society that favours profits over people. And I'll tell you this for nothing. When we get to episode 2, and when I talk about certain parts of the report and the things that came out in the report, which is very damning, by the way, I want you to realise that not long ago, billionaires went into a submarine, which was basically a can of beans. It was a tin can with a Xbox, PlayStation controller, whatever it was. And the whole world was looking for them. Nothing was left unturned in that effort to go down there, in a choice that they made. That was a choice. They had to go down there. And I'm sure that they didn't think it would end in tragedy, but it did. And I think when you take a calculated risk, if the circumstances and the consequences of that are tragic, we can mourn, but we can see the disparity of the whole world looking and people not sparing any expense. And then you have a situation like this. And even today in this country, there are people, I remember people in London trying to do things to commemorate. I remember seeing a tube driver stop the tube on the 14th of June, one of the years subsequent to the tragedy, to memorialise what happened and have a moment's silence. And I remember seeing the video and I was like, that's really touching, because it was such a big disaster, one of the biggest fire disaster in the UK in living memory. And I saw people going, oh, well, he should get fired for that. And you can say it's just internet trolls, but I don't know. I'm inclined to say that I've definitely heard those type of opinions when speaking about people from lower income backgrounds in all my time in working in finance. So it was unsurprising to me to see that. And I think we need to take a good look about the way that we use language when we're talking about, specifically about different groups of people, because thoughts become things and language becomes action. So there we are. And I'm going to leave it there for the subject of just talking about, Grenfell and what happened on that day. And I'm going to pick up in episode 2 or episode of the second part of this to talk about the report and how damning it is. So that's it. So that's it for me. I'm sorry, it's been kind of a heavy episode, but I definitely felt the need to speak a little bit about Grenfell, because I think it's something that's so important that we keep in our minds, because the conditions that led to Grenfell have not gone away. They are still very much there. And I think the more awareness we have about it, the better. So, yeah. So that's it from me. Thank you for joining me. If you want to contact me, you can contact me by email at themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com. The miss, 2 S's, informationpodcast@gmail.com. I'm also on social media at TikTok at The Reluctant Accountant, same handle at The Reluctant Accountant, on Instagram. But until next week.